His former business partner couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the face of the homeless man living under the bridge. Standing there in torn clothes and weathered boots was his old boss, the man who had sold his multi-million-dollar company 10 years ago and vanished without a trace. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of wealth abandoned and honor preserved, tell me in the comments, what would you do if you discovered your former millionaire boss living on the streets? And if you believe that true wealth isn't always measured in dollars, hit that subscribe button and help us share stories that matter. The underpass beneath Interstate 95 had been home to dozens of homeless individuals over the years, but none quite like the man they called the Major. He kept to himself mostly, occupying a corner spot near the concrete pillar where the rain couldn't reach him. His belongings were minimal: a military-issued sleeping bag that had seen better days, a backpack with carefully organized compartments, and a small camp stove that he used to heat canned food. What set the Major apart wasn't just his military bearing or the way he maintained his small corner of the underpass with meticulous precision. It was his eyes, sharp, intelligent, and carrying the weight of someone who had seen both the heights of success and the depths of human suffering. At 62, the Major moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to make every action count. His graying hair was always neatly trimmed, cut by his own hand using a small mirror and scissors he kept in his pack. His clothes were worn but clean, washed regularly in the public restrooms of nearby gas stations. Most people hurried past without a second glance, just another casualty of a system that had failed its veterans. But every Wednesday morning, the Major walked the 6 blocks to the downtown business district, not to panhandle or ask for work, but to sit on a specific bench outside the Meridian building, a 30-story office tower that housed some of the city's most successful companies. He would sit there for exactly 1 hour, watching the stream of suited professionals rushing to their meetings and power lunches. It was on one of these Wednesday mornings that David Chen, a 45-year-old marketing executive, decided to take a different route to his office. David was running late for a board meeting, his mind preoccupied with quarterly projections and client presentations. As he hurried past the bench, something made him glance down at the homeless man sitting there. The face was older, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, marked by lines that spoke of pain and sleepless nights. But the eyes were unmistakable. David stopped so abruptly that the businessman behind him nearly collided with him. "Robert," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the traffic. The man on the bench looked up, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Recognition flickered across his weathered features, followed immediately by something that looked like panic. "Robert Hartwell," David said louder, ignoring the curious stares of passing pedestrians. "My God, it's really you." The man who had been known as the Major for the past 10 years slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and careful. "Hello, David," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone David remembered from countless boardroom meetings. David stared at the man who had once been his mentor, his boss, and the driving force behind one of the most successful tech companies in the Southeast. Robert Hartwell, the entrepreneur who had built Meridian Technologies from a garage startup into a $100 million empire, was living on the streets. "I don't understand," David said, his voice shaking. "What happened? Where have you been?" Robert's jaw tightened, the same expression he used to wear when making difficult decisions in the boardroom. "I've been right here, David, right where I belong." The last time David had seen Robert was at the company's celebration dinner in 2013. Meridian Technologies had just been acquired by a Silicon Valley giant for $150 million, and Robert had insisted on throwing a party for all 200 employees. He had seemed happy that night, proud of what they had built together, excited about the future. 2 weeks later, Robert had disappeared. His lawyer had released a statement saying he was taking an extended vacation, that he needed time to decide what to do next. Months passed with no word. Eventually, rumors began to circulate that he had moved to Costa Rica, that he was sailing around the world, that he was writing a book about entrepreneurship. Nobody had imagined this. "Robert, please," David said, reaching out instinctively before stopping himself. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Robert looked around at the bustling street, at the building that still bore his company's name on the directory, at the world he had once commanded with such confidence. "You want to know what happened? You want to understand why I'm here?" David nodded, unable to speak. "Walk with me," Robert said, shouldering his backpack with the same efficiency he had once used to grab his briefcase for important meetings. They walked in silence for several blocks, moving away from the business district, toward a small park that bordered the river. Robert led David to a secluded bench overlooking the water, the same spot where he had come to think through difficult business decisions in his former life. "Do you remember Tommy Rodriguez?" Robert asked suddenly. David frowned, searching his memory. "Tommy, from the warehouse. He worked night shifts, had a family, 2 kids," Robert said quietly. "Jessica, 8 years old, and Marcus, 5. Tommy worked 2 jobs to support them after his wife died of cancer. He was saving money to go to nursing school, wanted to help people the way the nurses had helped his wife. David was confused. Robert, I remember Tommy. He was a good employee. But what does this have to do with? He died in Afghanistan. Robert cut him off. January 15, 2014. IED explosion during his second tour. He had joined the Army Reserve to help pay for school, to give his kids a better life. The words hung in the air between them like a physical weight. David stared at Robert, beginning to understand but not wanting to believe what he was hearing. I got the call from his sister, Robert continued, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. She said Tommy had always talked about his job at Meridian, how proud he was to work for a company that treated people right. She said he used to tell his kids that his boss was a good man, that America was a place where good people succeeded. Robert's voice cracked slightly. I was at my beach house in the Hamptons when she called. Do you know what I was doing, David? I was arguing with my decorator about whether the marble in my third bathroom was the right shade of white. David felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the weight of what Robert was telling him. I flew back for the funeral. Robert continued. Watched them fold that flag and hand it to his 8-year-old daughter. Watched her try to understand why her daddy wasn't coming home. And all I could think about was how I had been worried about marble while Tommy was dodging bullets in a desert on the other side of the world. Robert, that wasn't your fault, wasn't it? Robert turned to face him, his eyes blazing with an intensity David remembered from their most challenging business crises. I had just sold our company for $150 million. David, do you know what Tommy's life insurance policy was worth? $50,000. Barely enough to cover his funeral expenses and maybe a year of college for his kids. David was quiet, sensing that Robert needed to tell this story, needed to explain the decision that had led him to this park bench, to this life. I started thinking about all of them, Robert continued. All the people who had worked for us, who had believed in what we were building. Maria in accounting, who took care of her disabled mother. Jake in IT, who was supporting his younger brother through college. Sarah in marketing, who was working her way through law school at night. Robert's voice grew quieter. They were the ones who made Meridian successful. They were the ones who stayed late, who cared about the work, who believed in the mission. And what did they get when we sold? A pizza party and a $500 bonus. David wanted to protest, to point out that this was how business worked, that Robert had provided jobs and opportunities. But something in Robert's expression stopped him. I realized something that night after Tommy's funeral, Robert said. I had become everything I used to hate. I had started Meridian because I wanted to build something meaningful, something that would make a difference. But somewhere along the way, it became about the money, about the deal, about proving I could build something bigger than anyone expected. Robert stood up and walked to the edge of the river, his back to David. I went home that night and looked at my bank account. $150 million. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And all I could think about was Tommy's kids, trying to figure out how they were going to pay for college without their father. So you gave it away, David said, the pieces finally falling into place. Robert turned around, a sad smile on his face. Most of it, anonymously. Scholarships for military families. Support for veteran reintegration programs. Funds for the families of employees who had served. I kept enough to live on, but I couldn't keep living the life I had built on their backs. David stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. But Robert, you could have just donated the money and kept working. You could have started another company, done things differently. Robert shook his head. I tried for about 6 months. I tried to go back to that world. But every time I walked into a boardroom, every time I heard executives talking about human resources and optimization, all I could see was Tommy's daughter holding that flag. He sat back down on the bench, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. I realized that the problem wasn't just the money, it was the entire system. The way we measure success, the way we value human beings, the way we pretend that business is separate from morality. So you just left. I couldn't be part of it anymore, Robert said simply. I couldn't wake up every morning and participate in a system that I knew was fundamentally wrong. So I left. I gave away my houses, my cars, my stock portfolios. I kept one bank account with enough money to live on, and I walked away. David was struggling to understand. But Robert, living on the streets, this can't be what you wanted. Robert looked at him with the same patient expression he used to wear when explaining complex concepts to new employees. David, do you know what I've learned in the past 10 years? I've learned that the most important conversations happen between people who have nothing to lose. I've learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his net worth. I've learned that the people society throws away are often the most honest, the most real, the most human. He gestured toward the underpass in the distance. The people I live with, now they look out for each other. They share what little they have. They don't judge each other based on their bank accounts or their job titles. They understand something that I forgot during all those years of building my empire, that we're all in this together. David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he asked, "Don't you miss it? The company, the success, the life you built?" Robert considered the question carefully. "I miss the early days," he said finally. "When it was just 5 of us in the garage, trying to solve problems that mattered. When we stayed up all night because we believed in what we were building, not because we were chasing a quarterly bonus. I miss the feeling of creating something meaningful. But the rest of it, the money, the status, the power?" Robert shook his head. "That wasn't real success, David. That was just accumulated wealth. There's a difference." David looked at his former mentor, this man who had taught him everything he knew about business, about leadership, about success. "What do you do now? How do you spend your days?" Robert smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, it seemed genuine. "I help people. Veterans mainly. Guys who are struggling with the transition back to civilian life. I know the system. I know the programs. I know how to navigate the bureaucracy. I help them get benefits, find housing, connect with support services, and you do this from wherever I need to be," Robert finished. "Sometimes that's a coffee shop with free Wi-Fi. Sometimes it's a library. Sometimes it's right here, on this bench, making phone calls and filling out paperwork." David was amazed. "You're still running a business. You're still solving problems." "But now I'm solving problems that matter," Robert said. "Last month, I helped a Marine get his disability benefits approved. He'd been fighting the system for 3 years. 2 weeks ago, I connected a homeless veteran with a job training program. She's starting classes next month." Robert's voice grew stronger as he talked about his work. "I've helped dozens of people find housing, get medical care, reconnect with their families. I've sat with men who were contemplating suicide and helped them find reasons to live. I've been to more funerals than I can count, but I've also been to weddings, graduations, and baby showers for people who thought they had no future." David was beginning to see his former boss in a new light. "You're still a CEO, you're just running a different kind of company. The most important company I've ever run," Robert agreed. "And the compensation is different too. Instead of stock options and quarterly bonuses, I get to watch people rebuild their lives. I get to be part of their success stories." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow past. Finally, David asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Robert, I have to ask, do you ever regret it? Do you ever wake up and wish you had made different choices?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "There are nights when it's cold and raining, when I'm lying in that underpass listening to the traffic overhead, when I remember what it felt like to sleep in a warm bed. There are times when I'm hungry and tired, and I remember what it was like to have a chef and a housekeeper and a driver." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But then I think about Tommy's kids. Jessica is 18 now, starting her sophomore year at Duke University on a full scholarship. Marcus is 15, an honors student who wants to be a doctor. They're going to be okay, David. They're going to have the life their father wanted for them." Robert turned to face David directly. "And I think about all the other people I've been able to help. The veteran who got clean and sober and reconnected with his children. The woman who found housing and started her own business. The man who overcame his PTSD and became a counselor for other veterans. I think about the conversations I've had, the connections I've made, the lives I've touched, and I realize that this is the most successful I've ever been. Not financially, but in terms of what actually matters." David was quiet, absorbing everything he had heard. Finally, he asked, "What can I do? How can I help?" Robert smiled. "You can remember that success isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what you contribute. You can treat the people you work with as human beings, not resources. You can remember that every decision you make affects real people with real families and real dreams. But more than that," Robert continued, "you can remember that it's never too late to change course. It's never too late to ask yourself whether you're living the life you want to live, whether you're being the person you want to be." David pulled out his business card and wrote his personal phone number on the back. "Robert, I want to stay in touch. I want to help with what you're doing. Maybe there's a way to combine business success with social impact." Robert took the card and studied it. "David Chen, Senior Vice President of Marketing, Meridian Technologies." He looked up with a wry smile. They kept the name. "The company is doing well," David said. "We have over 500 employees now. But maybe it's time we did more than just make money." Robert stood up and shouldered his backpack. "Maybe it is. But remember, David, real change doesn't happen in boardrooms. It happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time." As they walked back toward the business district, David couldn't help but notice the way Robert moved through the world now. He nodded to the homeless man by the bus stop, exchanged a few words with the woman selling newspapers on the corner, stopped to pet a stray dog that recognized him. "They know you," David observed. "They're my neighbors," Robert replied simply. "They're my community. They're the people who matter to me now." When they reached the Meridian building, Robert stopped and looked up at the gleaming tower. "You know what I see when I look at that building now?" he asked. David shook his head. I see all the people who made it possible. The construction workers who built it, the janitors who keep it clean, the security guards who protect it, the food service workers who keep everyone fed. I see a community of people working together to create something bigger than themselves. Robert turned to David. That's what I should have seen when I was up there on the 30th floor. Not profit margins and market share, but people, human beings with hopes and dreams and families to support. David extended his hand. Robert, thank you for everything you taught me then and everything you've taught me today. Robert shook his hand firmly. Remember what I told you about success? David, it's not about what you accumulate, it's about what you contribute. As Robert walked away, blending back into the crowd of people, heading toward the underpass, David stood outside his office building and thought about the man who had just redefined everything he thought he knew about wealth, success, and what it means to live a meaningful life. That evening, David went home to his suburban house and looked at his life with new eyes. His comfortable salary, his retirement savings, his plans for promotion, all of it seemed suddenly hollow, compared to the quiet dignity of the man who had chosen to live under a bridge rather than participate in a system he could no longer morally support. Over the following weeks, David found himself thinking constantly about Robert's words. He began to pay attention to the people around him, really pay attention. He learned the names of the janitors in his building, started conversations with the security guards, made an effort to understand the challenges facing his colleagues. He also began researching veteran support organizations, wondering if there was a way for Meridian Technologies to do more than just write checks to charity. He wanted to create real programs, real opportunities, real change. A month later, David was walking past the same bench where he had found Robert when he saw a familiar figure sitting there. But this time, Robert wasn't alone. Next to him sat a young man in military fatigues, holding a folder full of papers. David approached cautiously. Robert? Robert looked up and smiled. David, I'd like you to meet Staff Sergeant Martinez. He just got back from his third tour in Afghanistan, and he's looking for work. The young veteran stood up and extended his hand. Sir, Mr. Hartwell has been helping me navigate the job search process. He thought you might know of opportunities for someone with my background. David shook the young man's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of service and sacrifice. What kind of work are you looking for? Sergeant, I was a communications specialist in the Army. Sir, I managed IT systems, coordinated logistics, led teams of technicians. I'm hoping to find work in the tech industry. David looked at Robert, who was watching the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Sergeant Martinez, I think we might have exactly what you're looking for. Would you be interested in coming in for an interview? The young man's face lit up. Yes, sir. That would be incredible. David handed him his business card. Call me tomorrow morning. We'll set something up. As the sergeant walked away, clutching the business card like a lifeline, David sat down next to Robert. How many? He asked. How many? What? How many people like him have you helped? Robert considered the question. In the past 10 years, maybe 200. But it's not about the numbers, David. It's about the individual stories, the individual lives that get changed. David nodded. I've been thinking about what you said, about combining business success with social impact. What if we created a formal program? What if Meridian Technologies became a pipeline for veteran employment? Robert's eyes lit up with interest. Tell me more. We could create a dedicated hiring program for veterans, not just token jobs, but real career opportunities. We could partner with training programs, provide mentorship, create advancement paths. We could prove that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking. It could work, he said finally. But it would have to be more than just a PR campaign. It would have to be real, meaningful change. I want it to be real, David said. I want to build something that Tommy Rodriguez would be proud of. Robert smiled, and David saw a glimpse of the passionate entrepreneur he had once worked for. Then let's build it. Over the following months, David and Robert worked together to create the Meridian Veterans Initiative. Robert remained homeless by choice, but he became an unofficial consultant to the program, helping design training curricula, interview protocols, and support systems that actually addressed the real challenges facing veterans. The program was an immediate success. Within 6 months, Meridian Technologies had hired 43 veterans, and the retention rate was higher than for any other hiring program in the company's history. The veterans brought discipline, leadership skills, and a work ethic that elevated the entire organization. But more importantly, the program began to change the culture of the company. Employees started to see their work differently, to understand that their success was connected to something larger than quarterly profits. They began to take pride not just in their paychecks, but in their contribution to their community. Robert still lived under the bridge, still spent his days helping veterans navigate the system, still chose to remain outside the traditional markers of success, but now he had a partner in his mission, someone who understood that true leadership meant serving others, not just serving oneself. One evening, as David was leaving the office, he found Robert sitting on their bench, reading a letter. There were tears in his eyes, but he was smiling. "Good news?" David asked. Robert handed him the letter. It was from Jessica Rodriguez, Tommy's daughter. She was writing to thank the anonymous donor who had funded her scholarship, but also to share news of her upcoming graduation and her acceptance to medical school. "She's going to be a doctor," Robert said quietly. "She's going to spend her life helping people, just like her father wanted to." David read the letter, feeling the weight of the young woman's gratitude and determination. "She doesn't know it came from you." Robert shook his head. "She doesn't need to know. What matters is that she has the opportunity to become who she's meant to be." As they sat there in the gathering dusk, David realized that he was looking at a man who had achieved something far more valuable than wealth or status. Robert had found peace. He had found purpose. He had found a way to live that was consistent with his values, regardless of what the world thought about his choices. "You think Tommy would approve?" David asked. Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I think Tommy would understand," he said finally. "I think he'd understand that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought right here, in our own communities, for the people we care about." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. "I think he'd be proud of what his daughter is becoming. And I think he'd be proud that his sacrifice meant something, that it led to something bigger than any of us could have imagined." As David walked home that night, he thought about the man who had given up everything to live according to his principles. Robert Hartwell had been successful as a businessman, but he had become truly great as a human being. He had learned that real wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the difference you make. The next morning, David arrived at his office to find a package on his desk. Inside was a small, worn notebook filled with handwritten notes. The first page had a simple inscription, "For David, a different kind of business plan." The notebook was filled with ideas, strategies, and philosophies for building companies that prioritized human value over shareholder value. It was a roadmap for doing business in a way that honored the dignity of every person involved, from the CEO to the janitor. As David read through the pages, he realized that Robert had given him something more valuable than any business advice he had ever received. He had given him a vision of what business could be when it was guided by conscience instead of just competition. Years later, when David had become CEO of Meridian Technologies and the company had become known as one of the most socially responsible corporations in the country, he would still meet Robert once a week at their bench by the river. They would talk about the business, about the veterans they were helping, about the community they were building, and Robert would still go home to his corner under the bridge, still content with his choice to live simply so that others could live better. He had found his own definition of success, and it had nothing to do with bank accounts or stock options. It had everything to do with the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, and the knowledge that he was using his gifts in service of something greater than himself. The man who had once been worth $150 million now owned almost nothing, but he had given away his wealth to create a foundation that would help thousands of veterans and their families for generations to come. He had inspired a company to redefine its mission from maximizing profits to maximizing human potential. Most importantly, he had shown that true success isn't about what you accumulate in life, it's about what you contribute. It's about the legacy you leave and the lives you touch. It's about having the courage to live according to your values, even when those values lead you to a place the world doesn't understand. Robert Hartwell, the homeless millionaire, had found something more valuable than money. He had found meaning. He had found purpose. He had found peace. And in a world that often measures worth by wealth, he had shown that the richest people aren't always the ones with the most money. Sometimes they're the ones who understand that true prosperity comes from lifting others up, not from climbing higher yourself. The man under the bridge had become the richest person in the city, not because of what he owned, but because of what he had given away, not because of what he had achieved, but because of who he had helped along the way. And every Wednesday morning, he still sits on that bench outside the Meridian building, ready to help the next veteran who needs someone to believe in their potential, ready to prove that heroes don't always wear suits and ties. Sometimes they wear worn-out boots and carry everything they own in a backpack. Sometimes they choose to be homeless so that others can find their way home. Have you ever met someone who redefined your understanding of success? Someone who showed you that wealth and worth aren't the same thing? Share their story in the comments below. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful transformations happen when we learn to measure our lives not by what we have, but by what we give. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you to think differently about success and sacrifice, subscribe to our channel and help us share more stories of quiet heroes who choose service over self-interest. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the next time you pass someone on the street whose story you don't know, take a moment to consider that you might be in the presence of someone who has chosen to give up everything for the sake of others.